Strait of Hormuz.
Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Instead of solving a geopolitical problem, the Muzandam Canal might simply create a more expensive and more fragile one. It moves the chess pieces, but the board remains the same. The world would still be playing the same high-stakes game, just on a much more expensive table. Ultimately, the Muzandam Canal may remain a bold engineering dream on paper. By the time the massive excavation could be completed, the world might have moved significantly toward green energy, reducing the strategic value of the canal. The extreme costs, security risks, and environmental destruction make the Strait of Hormuz, despite its fragility, the only viable option for now. We live in a world governed by geography, and sometimes geography is more powerful than all human technology. Made only brief remarks regarding Iran in the Strait of Hormuz.
They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no leaders, they have no nothing. Actually, their leaders it is regime change. You call that enforced regime change. But we're talking to them. They wanted to close up the strait again, as they've been doing for years, and they can't blackmail us.
It is also true that, before the war broke out, 20% of the world's oil passed through this choke point. But by March 2026, global oil production had actually shrunk by only about 8%. Prices, however, surged by 60%. That is 7.5 times greater than the contraction in supply. Eastern history, from once classified nuclear excavation plans to the brutal economic math, proving that our current alternatives are nothing more than a dangerous illusion. This is the quest to bypass the impossible. To understand why the world trembles at the mention of Hormuz, we must look at the cold, hard mathematics of energy. Daily, roughly 21 million barrels of crude oil flow through this strait. But where does this oil come from? It is the lifeblood of 5 major powers: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran. For these nations, the strait isn't just a route, it's a financial artery. Any blockage would instantly freeze the national budgets of Kuwait and Qatar, which export 100% of their seaborne energy through this single exit. But follow the flow to its destination, and the picture becomes even more terrifying. Roughly 76% of this oil is destined for Asian markets. China, the world's largest importer, pulls over 6 million barrels daily through here. However, the most vulnerable are Japan and South Korea. Japan relies on the Middle East for nearly 90% of its total oil consumption. For them, the closure of Hormuz isn't a fuel shortage. It is an immediate national collapse. News reports have often warned that without this flow, life in these hyper-industrialized nations would effectively grind to a halt within weeks.
They all closed the day sharply down based on this jump in the price of oil. I think now traders are just making a very simple calculation. They're asking a very simple question. Is this war any closer to being over? If it's not, then the price of oil is going to stay high. And I think people looked at what happened over the weekend, the entry of the Houthis in Yemen, there's that Iran-backed group, looking at the talk of a ground invasion perhaps, and they're thinking, well, this is certainly not de-escalating, this might escalate. And if things escalate, that means that the Strait of Hormuz is going to remain blocked because Iran controls it. Anything that goes through there is basically allowed to go through there because Iran says it's okay. And if oil and gas can't get through, if the fertilizer can't get through, if the cargo can't get through, then that's going to have ramifications for the world economy. So you're seeing that market reaction based on that simple calculation of this war being no closer to being over.
So that's what it looks like in Asia at the moment.
With ships sitting at sea, oil and gas prices have soared, including diesel up more than $1.50 a gallon since the start of the war.
Comparing Hormuz to the Suez Canal reveals the true scale. Hormuz moves 4 times more oil, yet the crisis is defined by engineering tightness. The actual deep water lanes used by very large crude carriers are only 2 miles wide in each direction. This means the energy security of the entire planet is compressed into a strip of water just 6 kilometers wide. We are no longer talking about a theoretical threat. Today, the war of the tankers is a living reality. Active skirmishes between American-led coalitions and regional forces have turned these narrow waters into a battlefield.
The United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
Trump said, "Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted, "Death to America," and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and innocent people in many, many countries.
Oh, God, please, no! No!
In retaliation for the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, the Iranian Navy broadcast the following message over VH Marine Radio.
From now on, all navigating through the Strait of Hormuz is forbidden. No ship in every type is not allowed to pass from the Strait of Hormuz till next notice.
To back up this declaration, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps used missiles and drones to attack vessels that dared to try to pass through the waterway, sending a clear message to all other ships and bringing traffic to a halt. According to reports, the attack occurred after tensions in the strait escalated. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that the strait would remain open to commercial vessels if they followed coordinated routes near Iran's coastline. U.S. President Donald Trump later announced that the strait was open to merchant ships, but that the U.S. naval blockade would continue. Iran responded immediately, declaring that due to ongoing acts of piracy by the United States, the strait would return to its previous status and be placed under strict control. This strait is entirely under the control of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We will make full use of it at any time, depending on the situation. The United States must understand this is not a place for bullying the weak or acting with arrogance. Although some sanctioned crude oil tankers and refined product carriers managed to pass through, many other vessels were forced to turn back as Iran once again tightened its control over the waterway. At an event held at the White House, President Donald Trump made only brief remarks regarding Iran in the Strait of Hormuz.
They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no leaders, they have no nothing. Actually, their leaders are, it is regime change. You call that enforced regime change, but we're talking to them. They wanted to close up the strait again, as they've been doing for years, and they can't blackmail us.
It is also true that, before the war broke out, 20% of the world's oil passed through this choke point, but by March 2026, global oil production had actually shrunk by only about 8%. Prices, however, surged by 60%. That is 7.5 times greater than the contraction in supply.
Because it's unclear how long the economies of this region can sustain this kind of total economic paralysis in the region. Most of the airports aren't working, financial districts aren't working, and as we know, there is zero oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz, but also 30% of the world's fertilizer goes through there, a significant proportion of the liquefied natural gas. All of that is absolutely frozen at this point, Major.
Big spike in oil prices globally today.
The world is already suffering from the fallout. Global logistics are strained, and energy prices fluctuate with every drone launch. This extreme dependency forces a brutal reality in risk mathematics. At the slightest hint of conflict, the war risk premium, the insurance cost for tankers, jumps by as much as $200,000 per voyage. The world is a hostage to this geography, pushing engineers to consider solutions once dismissed as sheer madness, including the nuclear option. There is a common belief, often repeated in mainstream media, that pipelines are the ready-made backup, but the economic and logistical reality says otherwise. Saudi Arabia's Petrolane has a maximum capacity of 5 million barrels per day. In the UAE's Habshan Fujairah pipe adds another 1.5 million. In other words, existing pipelines cover less than 30% of the total flow. There is a terrifying gap of 15 million barrels per day that simply cannot be moved except by sea. Pipelines are first aid for short crises, not a permanent strategic solution. Why not just build more pipes? The answer lies in cost and physics. Moving a barrel through a pipe can cost 3 times more than moving it via a VLCC tanker, which benefits from massive economies of scale. Furthermore, building enough pipes to handle 21 million barrels would mean covering the Arabian Peninsula in a massive steel web, vulnerable to sabotage at any point along thousands of kilometers. Pipelines aren't a replacement for the strait. They are a very narrow safety valve. The friction and pressure required to push 21 million barrels through steel tubes daily would consume astronomical amounts of energy and require hundreds of pumping stations. For the global market to remain stable, the sea is the only medium capable of handling this volume efficiently. This reality is what brought the idea of carving mountains back to the table as the only option for survival. If the pipes can't grow, the land must be cut. The proposal that has haunted the imagination of engineers for decades is the Musandam Canal. By cutting through the Isthmus of Makhlab, the geographical distance between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is reduced to a mere 15 kilometers. On a map, it looks like a stroke of genius, a shortcut that allows ships to bypass the strait and exit directly into the open ocean, far from the Iranian coastline. But Makhlab isn't a flat desert like Suez. It is part of the Hajar Mountains, some of the most rugged terrain on Earth. A canal capable of handling VLCC tankers requires a depth of at least 25 meters and a width of 300 meters. This project would require a staggering $100 billion budget, surpassing the annual GDP of several regional nations. It would require a global coalition led by superpowers terrified of an oil cutoff. This isn't just a canal. It is an attempt to rewrite the crust of the earth. Carving a path through the Musandam Peninsula isn't just digging, it is an act of geological violence. The Hajar Mountains are composed of exceptionally hard limestone and abrasive dolomite, rocks formed over 200 million years ago. These aren't just hills. We are dealing with jagged peaks that soar to 2,087 meters above sea level. To visualize the scale, the most difficult part of the Panama Canal, the Culebra Cut, required removing 76 million cubic meters of earth. The Musandam project would require removing over 1.2 billion cubic meters. We are talking about an excavation 15 times larger than the hardest project in human history. The physics of stable slopes makes this even more terrifying. Because these mountains are thousands of meters high, you cannot dig a vertical trench. The entire mountain would collapse into the water. Engineers would have to use benching, carving massive steps into the rock at 45-degree angles. This means that to have a 300-meter-wide canal at the bottom, the cut at the top of the mountain would need to be nearly 4 kilometers wide. You aren't just cutting a channel, you are effectively removing entire mountain ranges. Even compared to the Bingham Canyon mine, the largest man-made excavation on Earth, the Musandam Canal would be a logistical outlier. It would require the continuous operation of thousands of 400-ton haul trucks and a staggering amount of explosives, roughly 2 million tons of dynamite, just to shatter the rock. Furthermore, the Hajar limestone is notoriously abrasive, meaning drill bits and excavator teeth would need to be replaced every few hours. This is an engineering hell that dwarfs any open-pit mine or tunnel ever attempted. It is a $100 billion gamble against the very crust of the Arabian Plate. In the 1960s, during the American Project Plowshare, scientists proposed a terrifying idea, using peaceful nuclear explosions to carve canals. The plan was to plant a series of nuclear devices deep under the Musandam Mountains and detonate them simultaneously to vaporize the rock and create the canal in seconds. Theoretical calculations showed this method would save 90% of traditional excavation costs and cut decades of work down to days. But the price was radioactive dust that would poison the region for millennia, and the political suicide of using weapons of mass destruction as engineering tools. While the plan was buried, its existence proves the desperation engineers feel regarding Musandam. If nuclear weapons were seen as the cheap solution, you can imagine the sheer cost and difficulty of the traditional one. Now we arrive at the most critical strategic question. Is a canal actually safer than the strait? Most believe a canal means freedom, but it is actually an engineering trap. The Strait of Hormuz, despite its narrowness, is a wide natural waterway, giving ships room to maneuver or escape in emergencies. The 2021 Ever Given crisis in the Suez Canal was a harsh lesson. One ship stuck for 6 days paralyzed global trade. In the Musandam Canal, the situation would be 10 times worse because the only alternative during a blockage is returning to the Strait of Hormuz itself. Instead of protecting oil, we are concentrating it in an artificial choke point that can be paralyzed by a single mine or a mechanical failure. Why hasn't Oman rushed to build this project that could generate billions? The answer is national identity. Musandam is the Norway of the Middle East, famous for its fjords and ecotourism. Carving these mountains means destroying this heritage forever. There are also physical environmental challenges. The canal would mix waters with different temperatures and salinity levels. The Persian Gulf is much saltier and warmer than the Gulf of Oman. Shunting millions of cubic meters of water between them through an artificial channel would create a salinity shock, potentially destroying the local coral reefs and marine life that have evolved in isolation for millennia. Furthermore, Oman understands its future lies in sustainability. not in turning its crown jewel into a polluted industrial corridor. The construction phase alone would involve thousands of daily explosions, shattering the silence of the fjords and driving away the dolphins and wildlife that sustain the local economy. Oman prefers its role as the quiet mediator of the Middle East over becoming the center of a giant industrial scar. For Muscat, some treasures are worth more than $100 billion in transit fees. Politically, the dilemma is even larger. The Strait of Hormuz gives Iran immense global leverage. Building a canal would be seen as a hostile act to strip away this influence. Experts warn that the conflict wouldn't end. It would simply move from the entrance of the strait to the exit of the canal in the Gulf of Oman. Building the canal doesn't change the fact that Iran possesses the largest missile and naval arsenal in the region. If the goal is to bypass a threat, the canal merely provides a new target. Furthermore, the legal status of such a canal would be complex. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of transit passage, which shall not be impeded.
The Secretary General stresses that all parties to this conflict must respect freedom of navigation, including in the Strait of Hormuz, in line with international law.
Would a private Omani canal be subject to the same rules? The world would still face the same military balances, just at a different, more exposed location. Any superpower funding the canal would also have to commit to a massive, permanent naval presence at its mouth to protect it. Narrowest point, this passage is only 33 kilometers wide, with shipping lanes measuring less than 3. It is a choke point that has effectively put the global energy market under siege. Every geopolitical tremor here sends immediate shockwaves from New York to Tokyo. For decades, a bypass was a strategic dream. Now, it is a desperate race for survival. The proposed solution? A high-stakes mission costing $100 billion. A massive canal carved through the 2,000-meter peaks of the Musanam Peninsula. We are dissecting the most extreme engineering challenge in Middle East. The impossible bypass isn't just about money, it's about whether we can or should remake the planet to save an old energy model. Do you think the world will ever dare to carve these mountains? Or will Hormuz control the global economy forever?